Herbie had been warned that the weather-worn two-story was known to creak and groan, Grandma Beatrix had rambled on about it when she sent him off to bed that evening. The wind comes in fast off the desert. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a sandstorm sometime before winter's done, she had said. Herbie thought it was an odd thing to bring up when saying goodnight. He hadn't expected to be repeating it to himself as he lay locked in terror with the floorboards and wooden ceilings sighing and rasping through the night, keeping him away from a much-deserved night's rest. He had never known wind to howl so ferociously or heard such viciousness in its tone. Back in Washington, D.C., his double-glazed glass windows would have blocked out such a ruckus. And so, to Herbie's untrained ear, it rang with a supernatural eeriness, like a werewolf howling at a full moon. He forced the idea from his mind, as his body begged for sleep. He had spent all day carrying boxes out of the moving van, and this had left his scrawny arms feeling limp. He had spent all evening unpacking his belongings, taking account of everything he had been forced to leave behind, each missing item battering his heart a little more. He had never been so tired, body and soul, but his mind had not gotten the message his body was desperately sending, and giving in to his insomnia, he grabbed the old brass compass his father had left him off his nightstand. In the dim light of the Cosmos projector that painted constellations and white pinpricks on his ceiling, he ran his fingers along the compass's back plate where the initials P were neatly engraved to the left and right of a mess of scratch marks that someone had haphazardly etched in, distorting the beauty of the work. He spun it around and watched the needle readjust itself to face north, wondering what his father had tried to cover up alongside his initial, anything to distract him from the ceaseless howling of the wind. He had only ever seen digital renderings of such things on augmented displays in a virtual reality game, the same game that had soaked into every crease of his mind. Rouge et Noir. Herbie had spent as much time with his virtual reality headset strapped on, lost in virtual Elizabethan Europe, as he had in the real world in the last few weeks, desperate to escape the chaos that had consumed his life. In the virtual world, he was a cunning werewolf hunter, slashing up and shooting down abominable werewolves in the light of a virtual full moon. He would investigate suspicious townsfolk to see if they were the ones transforming on those silver nights. He would listen out for such menacing howls, as he heard now, to know when a beast was near, but he had been forced to leave that world behind in Washington, D.C., although his subconscious was yet to fully readjust to reality. And so, despite his desperation for sleep, his brainwashed mind refused to ignore the wind blowing by, staying alert, on edge, waiting for an attack. But the closer he listened, the greater and stranger subtleties he heard in its notes, as though it were carrying voices across the desert. There was something rhythmical to it, like the chanting of a cannibalistic tribe dancing deep in the Amazon jungle, thanking their twisted gods for an unspeakable feast. As his thoughts and imagination swirled into an inseparable nightmare, he was tempted to run and ask for help, if only to hear somebody tell him that everything was okay and he had nothing to worry about. But he didn't have too many options available. He definitely didn't want to wake his grandma. They had only met for the first time that morning, and she seemed as tough as nails with little time for a crybaby. Plus, her pet Sierra Red Fox, Goji, was notoriously protective of her and would probably wake up the whole house if he knocked on her door. He thought for a second that perhaps it was Goji making the racket downstairs that he was hearing, but just as the thought was birthed in his mind, the wind howled again, carrying the strange chants on its back, sounds that Goji simply wasn't capable of making. Quivering with fear, he wondered if his mom would listen to him, smile and grab him with a handful of blankets and pull him into the bed like she had when he was younger, but she hadn't said a word in weeks. In fact, she had barely moved, and if she did so more like a zombie than a person, staring out blankly at something only she could see. Just the thought of it was enough to make Herbie man up, roll over, and try to sleep. He pulled his blankets over his head and breathed in a mouthful of hot air. He squeezed his eyes closed and did his best to shut out the world around him and drift off into his dreams. But Herbie was not predestined to sleep that night, because it was not long before the orchestra of noises in the night climaxed into an incredible crescendo. The song was clear and loud, dark and tribal. It rang with an evil that Herbie had never experienced in his entire life. Herbie threw the blankets off and stared in terror at the denim curtains drawn over his bedroom window as the wind carried the deep and foreboding chanting across the desert and into his room, as though the bloodthirsty tribesman in his vision sat waiting just outside his room. He covered his ears as the sheer intensity seemed to shake his brain around in his skull. He waited, terrified, for the moment to end. The cacophony gradually faded as the wind switched direction, sending Herbie running over to the window. He threw open the curtains, expecting to see something, anything that would prove the experience to be more than mere hallucination. But Herbie could have never anticipated what appeared before his eyes. The night was clear, now strangely quiet and completely still, other than 6 bright burning lights hovering casually beside the crescent moon. He squinted at them, not sure if they were merely stars piercing through the void of space. The moment hung on timelessly. Herbie stared in awe at the hypnotizing lights which seemed to be staring right back at him. His eyes did their best to focus in the darkness. The longer he looked, the more one half of his mind assured him that these were only stars, and that the ruckus was something out in the distance, and there was nothing worth worrying about. But the other half of his mind sensed a menacing aura about them, something altogether unnatural. There was evil in the way they hung there, something Herbie couldn't quite explain to himself. He watched them for what seemed like an eternity, his mind desperate to resolve this paradox of normality and absurdity. He was almost ready to close the curtains and try to fall asleep again when he noticed the lights began to dart left and right, like a wildcat stalking its prey. They held their formation as they began to dance in the darkness. His heart pounded as his eyes remained locked on the lights. He could feel the blood pumping in his ears and his mind becoming murky with a million unanswerable questions. Sweat began dripping from his brow, and a voice inside of him cried to go back to his home in Washington, D.C., where stars knew that they were intended to find their positions in the sky and stay there for the night. The 6 lights moved faster and faster, shooting back and forth across the horizon, and then suddenly went plummeting to the earth and out of sight. Herbie stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he had just seen. But then something suddenly filled the air. It wasn't the howl of a werewolf or the chants of cannibals, but the desperate cries of a human. Breaking free from the paralysis of shock, Herbie leaned out of his second-floor window and anxiously looked around to see if he could find where the noise was coming from. But the streetlights were broken, and the moon wasn't bright enough to reveal any details of the road in front of the house. He leaped out of bed and flicked on his bedroom light, hoping to better penetrate the black void of the night. He returned to the window and leaned out as far as he could. The sound of feet running on asphalt echoed down the street, getting closer and closer by the second. But the light from his room only illuminated a small square of tarmac in the all-consuming darkness. His ears locked onto the mad pounding of footsteps, his mind trying to visualize how far down the street they were and just what could be causing them. Then out of nowhere, a young woman tripped on the road, falling into the square of light coming from Herbie's bedroom window. She instinctively lifted her head up toward the light, locking eyes with him. She had long brown hair hanging across her pale face, though even from a distance, Herbie could see the glaring whites of her desperate eyes piercing through. Her clothes were ripped and blood-stained, fresh scratches bleeding red on her scrawny white arms. "Hey," he called out to her, "are you okay?" She froze, paused a moment, then screamed. Herbie stumbled back into his bedroom, startled by the blood-curdling screech that echoed down the street. "What the—" he yelped to himself as he tried to gather his senses. After a moment, he stuck his head back outside again. But the young woman was gone, leaving only the sound of her footsteps running off into the empty lot across the road from the house. Herbie ran across his room and grabbed his jacket off the hook by his bedroom door. "I can't go out there," he thought as he zipped himself up and instinctively grabbed his outdated cell phone off his nightstand, noticing the brass compass and deciding to take it along as well. I could get killed. His thoughts continued as he ran down the stairs, grabbing the banister and jumping 3 steps at a time. I would have to be completely insane to take a single step out of this house, he concluded to himself, as he threw open the front door and ran across the street. Outside, Herbie squinted as he gazed out into the desert, and thought that maybe, off in the distance, he could see the young woman's silhouette peering out of the darkness. One half of his brain told him it was over, she was gone, that he had no other option but to go back to bed and try and get some sleep. But the other half was still lost in the virtual world of Rouge et Noir. It told him he was at the edge of the Black Forest in Germany, that a damsel was in distress, that to move the game forward, he would have to chase after her. "Hey, stop running," he called out as he sprinted after her, entering the lightless abyss of the desert. But Herbie soon found out that running in reality was a lot more tiresome than getting a character to run in a virtual reality, panting as his sprint turned into a jog. Looking around to try and get his bearings, he realized he had never known such complete and utter darkness in his life. The streets of D.C. had always had some nearby light source to cut through the void of night, whether it be a street lamp or neon sign. As he pushed forward, it became apparent to him that his eyes might as well be closed, and the silhouette running off in the distance only a hallucination that his mind was using to fill the darkness. "Hey, slow down," he called to her, hoping for a response to put his fears at ease, though he could only just hear the faint steps of scurrying feet in sand, urging him forward, further and further away from the old wooden house behind him. Herbie tried to turn his head to look behind him to see how far he had run. Unfortunately, he employed tactics he would have used while playing Rouge et Noir and didn't stop running while bending his neck around. His body became completely disorientated as his top and bottom halves went off in opposite directions, tangling his feet into one another and tripping him over. He fell through the air, sending his uncoordinated limbs off in every direction, and bringing his weight down squarely onto his right knee. "Ow!" he moaned, rubbing his stinging kneecap. "This imagination of mine is going to get me killed one day," he mumbled aloud, while trying to examine himself for scrapes and bruises under the unyielding light of the crescent moon. He looked back to see if he could make out his bedroom light, off in the distance, and was met by only a pinprick-sized dot out in the distance, far smaller than he had thought it would be. He then looked to see if he could still make out the young woman's silhouette way out in front of him, if it had ever been real. But his breath suddenly froze in his lungs. In the absolute darkness, he could no longer make out the barely audible sound of her feet slapping on the desert sands, but rather a slow, gurgling pant. It felt close, too close. She should have been much further away by now, unless she had decided to turn around and run toward him. And the breaths seemed to be edging closer with every hot, wet pant, until eventually, Herbie could feel it brushing up against his cheek. His eyes were gradually adjusting to the darkness. Thin silver halos reflecting the crescent moon's light revealed the outlines of the tough desert shrubs and small clumps of rocks. Then he saw something larger, hunched over, just a few feet away from him. It was her. It must have been. "Hey," Herbie stuttered through the sudden jolt of fear. "Are you okay?" The glob of shadows said nothing. It crouched on its haunches, scowling, panting. He squinted, desperately trying to determine if the thing in front of him was man or beast, or worse. As he focused, he thought he could make out her thick clots of hair across her face, the shimmering whites of her eyes. Did those lights in the sky scare you? What were they? He tried again. The shadow shifted, rising from its haunches, looming larger, edging closer to him. "Hey, what are you doing?" "I'm not trying to hurt you," he assured, desperate to get a human response from her. It came closer, slowly, as if it was making sure it didn't startle him and scare him away. It was doing a terrible job as suddenly, that was all Herbie wanted to do. Maybe I should go. It looks like you're okay," Herbie continued, trying not to show how terrified he was. As the strange silhouette moved in much closer, a drop of something warm and wet fell on Herbie's hand. He swallowed hard and picked himself up off the ground. "Yep, that's me. I'm gonna go home. My grandma's probably wondering where I went." The clump of darkness moved toward him as he started to back away. Herbie could now see that she, or it, reached toward him with a long, wet appendage dripping with some indeterminable liquid. "Oh boy," he whispered to himself as his eyes went wide. He suddenly realized this was not in the virtual world of Rouge et Noir. There was no respawn point to go back to if he died. He was out in the dark with his life in his own trembling hands. Shaking, he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. Unlocking the screen, a bright beam of pale blue light lit up his face. He turned it toward the mass of shadows. In that instant, all he saw was hands covered in thick crimson blood, inches from his face, and snarling lips revealing a mouth full of vicious white teeth. In a flash, Herbie turned around and ran as fast as he could, screaming, "Werewolf!" hoping that someone somewhere would hear his desperate cries for help. Despite the massive burst of adrenaline coursing through his veins, his legs and lungs were already at their limit, and his knee was throbbing with pain, begging him to slow down. But his ears were locked on the thumping of feet, ripping through the sands at an incredible speed behind him, and told him that a single stumble could mean his untimely end. His eyes focused on the light from his distant bedroom window, too scared to turn around, just waiting to feel the creature dig a bloody claw into his shoulder. There was a metallic taste in his mouth. Each breath of air stung his throat, and despite his pleas for his body to keep running, he knew he would soon collapse. Then, coming from his house, Herbie heard the strange yapping of Beatrix's Sierra Red Fox, "Go-Gee." "Herbie," a familiar voice called out to him from the distance. "Help! Please help!" Herbie screamed back, hoping they were not his last words. He could see someone standing at his front door, Grandma Beatrix. Go-Gee yipped and howled beside her in a high-pitched squeal. Herbie dug deep in himself and found the energy for one last push. Now he could make Beatrix out clearly, her old saggy body bouncing around in her nightgown as she ran toward him. Go-Gee darted in front of her, taking a defensive stance and growling. Beatrix opened her arms, and Herbie used them as a target for one last sprint. He reached out to grasp her protective embrace. Much to Herbie's surprise, he did not feel his grandma's arms wrap around him and pull him away from the creature behind him, but instead, he received a rather tough tug on the ear. "What in heaven's name are you doing out in the cold in the middle of the night?" Grandma Beatrix berated, all the time pulling on his ear so hard that he had to tilt his head. Herbie did his best to catch his breath, but his ribs and lungs were pulsing with pain. "Werewolf," he cried through his panting. "There's a werewolf chasing me," worming himself around in her grasp to turn and see how close the creature was behind him. "No, there isn't," Grandma Beatrix lashed back, using her grip on his ear to turn his head to face the desert. Goj yipped an impatient bark at Herbie, as though the vixen was berating him alongside Beatrix. He looked back at the empty lot and into the darkness of the desert. There wasn't a soul in sight. "I swear, there were lights in the sky, and then I heard screaming, and then—" "That's enough of that, young man," Beatrix interjected. "Now get into bed. There ain't no such thing as werewolves." Herbie's mouth dropped, as he realized he would not be given the chance to defend himself. Grandma Beatrix scowled at him, letting him know that she would have none of his nonsense. "And don't let me catch you out and about after bedtime again," she said sternly. At that, she let go of Herbie's ear and held his hand as Goji led the way across the road to the porch. He was too tired to argue, too tired to say a single word. Even though Grandma Beatrix had been less than comforting, he was relieved to have her beside him, keeping him safe. As Herbie and Grandma Beatrix reached the front door, he heard the soft hum of an electric engine behind him. Goji whirled around into an attack stance, arching her back up and growling at the sudden noise. Herbie turned to see a black Valac sedan, the Templar, a new model with sleek futuristic lines and black-tinted windows, driving suspiciously slowly past his house. He looked back at Beatrix with questioning eyes. "Never you mind them. Off to bed with you," she instructed, and gave Herbie a light smack on the bottom to hurry him up the stairs. She shot Goji a no-nonsense glare, which was enough to get the vixen back into the house, and darting toward Beatrix's bedroom on the ground floor, the Valac Templar came to a gradual stop outside the house and stood there. No business to keep it occupied other than the dimly lit night, the desert, or whatever monsters that could be lurking around. Herbie swallowed hard as the adrenaline cleared from his veins. wondering if it was possible that he had imagined the whole thing, that his time in the virtual world had blurred the lines between reality and fantasy. But he felt his face turn ashen as he looked at his hand while climbing the stairs towards his bedroom. Just between his thumb and index finger was a single drop of crimson blood. "Herbie, breakfast!" Herbie's brain woke up, but his eyes were having none of it. He lay there as if in a daze. "I'm not calling again, young man," Grandma Beatrix called from downstairs. Herbie flipped himself over, desperate to catch up on lost sleep, but more wary of Beatrix's temper. As he turned, his muscles cramped up and sent a bolt of pain through his body. "Ow," he groaned softly to himself. He pulled himself up, clenching through the cramps, and gazed around groggy-eyed as he tried to make sense of the unfamiliar surroundings. As his memories realigned themselves, his heart sank. This was not his room in Washington, D.C. The desk in the corner was covered in dust and held only a rusted tin with some old pens and pencils in it. His desk in Washington, D.C. had hosted a top-of-the-line PC with an almost unlimited collection of the latest games installed on it. The walls were old wood panels with chipped paint that may have been white once upon a time. All that he had to cover them were a few framed posters that the repo men had found worthless. A portrait of Einstein with a model of space-time curvature in the background, the famous pale blue dot photograph of Earth as seen by the Voyager 1 space probe, and a diagram dissecting the upcoming manned mission to Mars, and of course, the Cosmos projector, still shooting out dots of light onto the roof and walls in the early morning sun. Other than that, the room was barren. No flat-screen TV, no virtual reality bodysuit and headset, no nothing. Herbie wriggled around on his mattress and listened to the old springs twang. He wondered how many hours of sleep he managed to get in. Gauging by his weariness, it was 3 or 4 at best, and even those few hours were plagued by nightmares of a werewolf stalking him in the desert. Herbie shook his head clear of the image and took a deep breath, and gazed into the eyes of Einstein staring back at him from the wall. No scientist would ever conclude that a werewolf was running around the Nevada desert last night. Ridiculous, he consoled himself, but when he looked to his hand, he could still see a stain of reddish-brown, where a drop of blood had been the night before. Then again, if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, he continued to himself as he inspected the small muddy lines set into his skin. He could hear Beatrix's heavy footsteps echoing from downstairs. "I'm not that old, boy. I'll drag you down if I have to," she called from the foot of the stairs. "Coming," Herbie yelled back. "Correlation does not imply causation. Now get it out of your head," he whispered to himself as he tentatively got out of bed. Reluctantly willing his body to move, he carefully stretched out his back, biting his lip as his swollen knee throbbed with pain. He slowly got dressed. He opened his bedroom door and took a moment to readjust the sign he had fixed to the outside of it with double-sided tape. "Warning, dimensional rift. The occupant of this room is saving the world in alternate realities. Proceed with caution. Bring snacks." He sighed deeply as he read it, saddened that he no longer had access to virtual worlds, and less importantly, snacks. Beatrix was waiting in the kitchen, standing over an old iron stove, stirring a pot with goji at her feet, completely entranced by what she was doing. Herbie sat down at one end of the kitchen table and soaked in the outdated stylings of the room. Thick skins of white paint peeled off the ancient wooden walls, scratches and stains appearing here and there, telling the story of countless kitchen gatherings. Black smudges of soot lined the paint-chipped wooden panels behind the stove, where hundreds, if not thousands of meals had been cooked. The stove seemed like something out of a museum, with its big stone chimney sticking out from behind it. The cabinets were weather-worn, and most had their doors hanging loosely on their hinges. It was strange and alien, and all too Gothic. Nothing like the sleek modern design of his house in Washington, D.C., but it was lived in, like a history book secretly recording the lives of those who lived in it, and Herbie couldn't help but smile as he inspected its silent stories. Herbie waited for Beatrix to say something, letting the moment hang in an awkward silence before the tension grew too much for him. "What was going on last night?" he finally exclaimed. The stars were flying round and that strange lady screaming down the street. He paused a moment before coughing, the werewolf under his breath. "Boy, what are you on about?" Beatrix replied without turning around. "Didn't you hear all the commotion? Crazy tribal chants, a girl in ripped-up clothing yelling at the top of her lungs. She wasn't exactly trying to be discreet," Herbie insisted. "Nope," Beatrix replied impatiently. Herbie scratched his head, not sure if he was going mad. He sighed deeply. His investigation would be a solo mission by the looks of it. "So what's for breakfast?" Herbie asked lightheartedly, trying to move the conversation out of the cloud of tension it had drifted into. "Oatmeal," Beatrix replied with as much excitement as the porridge itself. "In Washington, we had bacon for breakfast," Herbie insisted. Beatrix turned around and faced him, clearly unimpressed. "We've had 6 years of drought, young man. The Bower Ranch is the only pig farm left in town, and they don't even stock their meat in our stores anymore," Beatrix said sternly. "Does that mean there's no bacon in the whole town?" Herbie asked, aghast. "It means as long I'm keeping 3 people fed on my pension, we're having oatmeal for breakfast," Beatrix replied. Herbie pursed his lips as he digested the information. He sighed deeply, but tried to hide his disappointment. "What is oatmeal, anyway?" he probed curiously. Grandma Beatrix was clearly taken aback. "You've never had oatmeal, boy?" she questioned. "Never heard of it, but I'm always up for something new," Herbie replied. At that, Beatrix shrugged. "They're oats, and it's your meal. Simple enough." She turned back to stirring the pot. "I should have guessed. Where's Mom? Do you think she would like it?" he asked optimistically. He watched Beatrix's shoulders drop. She stopped stirring as she thought about how to handle her response. She rested the wooden spoon on the pot handle and walked over to him. "Your ma needs her sleep. She's on a lot of pills to help her with what she's going through, and they make her very tired." Herbie was surprised to see the sudden switch in his grandma's demeanor. He tilted his head as he saw for the first time since arriving at her house the authoritarian overlord slip away and a kind old woman appear. "I know what antidepressants are, Grandma," Herbie smiled. "Practically everyone in Washington takes them. Even 14-year-olds like me." Beatrix gave him a skewed look, clearly not pleased. Her tough exterior grew back like a skin of thick bark. She went back to the stove to dish up the oatmeal, laying out 2 bowls on the table before taking a seat opposite Herbie. Goji seemed displeased that the second bowl was being delivered to him, and not to her. She scurried under Herbie's feet, placing her head in his lap, and made a sound that seemed like a mixture between a growl and a purr. "Down, Goji, you don't even like oatmeal," Beatrix tisked at her, which sent the vixen scurrying back to Beatrix's side. Herbie stared down at the brown mush and shivered, wishing Goji would finish it for him. "My bedroom's pretty boring," Herbie dared as he pushed the sludge around with his spoon. No VR, no PC, and no Q-lock board. "What in heaven's name is a Q-lock board?" Grandma Beatrix disparaged, wiping a bit of oatmeal off her lip with a napkin. "It stands for quantum locking board. It's got superconductors cooled down to near absolute zero, allowing them to lock onto magnetic fields, which makes them float." Beatrix stared back at him wide-eyed. "Well, we don't have anything like that around this house, and that was your father's room anyway. He always seemed to make do." The words hit Herbie like an arrow to the gut. It wasn't in his nature to let life get him down. He hated feeling sorry for himself. But some things just couldn't be ignored. He looked down into his bowl and tried to fight back the tears. Beatrix hadn't meant to upset Herbie. He seemed to be taking everything so well, other than running out into the desert in the middle of the night, and she had forgotten what he was going through. "I didn't mean to upset you, boy," she said softly. "I'll tell you what. Finish up your breakfast and come meet me at the barn. I've got a surprise for you." Herbie looked up at her with a smile. "What surprise?" he asked happily. "Oh, you'll see. Now hurry up." At that, Herbie took a hefty spoonful of oatmeal and shoved it in his mouth. He froze. "Guama," he spoke with the oatmeal still in his mouth, spilling over his lips. "Thwis is a guas," Herbie continued, too scared to swallow. Beatrix shook her head with a cheeky smile. "Well, you better get used to it, Herbie Hunter. Now get it down and get washed up. In the meantime, I've got some business in the barn." Herbie shivered in his coat as he stepped out onto the front porch. The weather was surprisingly similar to Washington, D.C., despite being at the other end of the country, but Herbie had rarely spent time outdoors in winter, other than getting on and off the autobus during the week. He preferred the comfort of his room. He made his way over to the barn, hands deep in his pockets. This place sure is cold for a desert, he thought to himself as he gazed out into the sands. He got a sick feeling in his gut as he wondered what had happened to the young woman from the night before. Had his exhaustion got the better of him and made him imagine the whole thing? Or if she were real, what had happened to her to make her act so crazy? And most importantly, whose blood had dripped onto his hand? Hers, or something she had killed? "What are you doing just standing there?" Beatrix called from the barn. Herbie snapped out of his ponderings and walked over. The barn was a perfect fit for the house, wooden, old, and falling apart. As he approached, the right-hand door creaked open and Beatrix's face peeked out. "Are you ready?" Her face gleamed. Herbie loved surprises, though he usually only got to experience them while submersed in a virtual reality game. But this was so much better, the suspense building up, the tip of his nose and ears tingling from the cold. It was all so new and thrilling to him. "So ready," he said with a toothy smile. Grandma Beatrix pushed both the doors from the inside, sending them swinging open and slamming against the sides of the barn with a crash. A single bulb hung from the rafters within, illuminating the most beautiful thing Herbie had ever seen. In the dim yellow light sat a 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner. Herbie had raced in one in a VR game, but he never could have imagined that there was still one in existence outside of a museum, let alone in his grandma's barn. The front bumper hung loose, the hood scoop was cracked, the headlight covers were smashed, and the soft top had caved in and was torn, allowing the tattered black leather interior to be flooded with dust. A layer of dirt had settled on the convertible like dusty brown icing on a cake, but green and black paint peeked through in spite of it, hinting at its former glory. Herbie stood before it in absolute awe. Beatrix beamed, seeing her grandson so happy. "For me?" Herbie stuttered, once his wits had returned. "Yep, I got it for your father when he was just a boy. You can take it for a ride around town if you like." Beatrix smiled. Herbie turned to her, absolutely amazed at the offer. "It works?" "Of course it works," Beatrix laughed back. "It's just a little rusted." Herbie smiled like a madman. "We'll just have to watch out for cops. I'm only 14, you know." Beatrix tilted her head in confusion. "What are you on about, boy?" "I don't have my learner's permit yet," Herbie confirmed. Beatrix examined her grandson. "You don't need a learner's permit to ride a bicycle," she puzzled. "A what?" Herbie asked. "A bicycle," Beatrix confirmed, pointing to a rusty old frame on wheels leaning up against the side of the barn. "Oh," Herbie pondered, "not the car? No, not the car." Beatrix exploded at the sheer ridiculousness of the idea. "That's my Roadrunner. Don't you dare touch it." Herbie pouted as he tried to figure out just what was happening. "So that, motorbike without a motor is a bicycle?" Beatrix exclaimed. "You must know what a bicycle is." "I'm not really too outdoorsy," Herbie shrugged. "I'd take my Q-Lock board out on the streets every once in a while in the summer, but otherwise I play VR games." "What's this VR business you're always going on about?" Beatrix tutted. "Virtual reality. You put on a headset and suit, and it's like going into another world." Herbie smiled. Beatrix shook her head. "Well, no wonder you're chasing after visions in the middle of the night. You can't tell what's real or not." Herbie squinted at her. "You know it's the year 2026 and you don't even know what virtual reality is. I could be equally shocked by you. There's no need to act like I'm crazy." Beatrix crossed her arms and scowled at him. "Back in my day, when people spent their lives in imaginary worlds, we called them crazy." Herbie locked eyes with his grandma, and she fiercely met his gaze in return. A staring match of scowls quickly ensued, until finally Herbie burst out laughing, causing Beatrix to drop her guard and laugh along with him. "I guess it is kind of crazy when you put it like that," Herbie chuckled. Beatrix shook her head. Well, are you going to get on or not? Herbie sighed. I have no idea how to use that thing. A wave of sadness overtook Beatrix's smile. 14 years old and no idea how to ride a bicycle. I thought I'd raised a better son, thought he'd be a better father. At least one good enough to teach his own son to ride a bike. Could you stop that? Herbie interrupted with a crooked smile. I barely knew him. There isn't any reason why I should be sad about him dying. But you keep making me want to cry. In that moment, Beatrix could see all the pain he was hiding beneath that easygoing attitude, and she felt that maybe there was more to this strange boy who seemed like a visitor from the future. It's all right to miss your own pa, Herbie. No matter how close you were, there's a special place in our hearts we keep for our... I said stop. Herbie snapped. I'm out in the cold. My muscles ache from chasing after lunatics in the middle of the night. My knee is all busted up, and apparently there's a whole other side to the world that I had no idea existed. I don't have time to sit around and cry. Herbie breathed deeply as he got a hold of himself. I don't have the strength. Beatrix could do nothing but stare, irritated by his audacity, but ultimately won over by her empathy for the boy's pain. Herbie was having none of it. He didn't have time for long, heartfelt staring matches. So, he announced, breaking the tension, are you going to show me how this relic works? Beatrix smiled and nodded in the direction of the bicycle. All right, Herbie Hunter. I'll show you how to ride a bike, and I'm sure you'll get it in no time. You know why? Why is that? Herbie replied, still a little fed up. Because you're so much stronger than you could ever imagine. Beatrix could remember teaching her son to ride a bicycle when he was 5 years old. The experience was magical, telling him it was all going to be okay if he scraped his elbow, seeing his little face light up as he finally got the hang of it. It was one of the fondest memories she had of him. She had been excited to forge the same memories with Herbie, but teaching her grandson was somewhat more challenging. He was far too heavy for her to hold up, and once he did manage to get the bicycle rolling, she couldn't keep up with him to catch him when he inevitably went skidding off the road. Goji had caught wind of the excitement and had darted out of the desert where she'd been hunting for lizards to yap and growl at Herbie as he struggled to keep his balance. To remind me why you have a wild animal living in your house, Herbie moaned from the side of the road, his face pressed against the dirt, the rusted old bicycle lying on top of him, and Goji tugging at his jeans. Because his parents never taught him any manners, Beatrix laughed back at him. Herbie scowled at her as he lifted himself back up, much to Goji's displeasure. She hissed at him as Herbie wrestled his jeans out of her clenched jaw. I meant the fox, Herbie spat. She got separated from her family when she was just a pup. No thanks to all the development in town ripping up the land. Didn't trust no one to take care of her, so she lives with me now. Aren't they endangered? Herbie questioned, knowing that it was hard to find a wild animal not on the endangered species list, thanks to the persistent drought. Aren't you supposed to be up on that bicycle? Beatrix insisted, not appreciating his line of questioning. Herbie sighed as he lifted up the bike, tired of getting his ankles and knees bashed. Can't we do this another time? This is what we do for fun around here, so you best get used to it now. Come on, you, get back up on it. Herbie reluctantly rolled the bicycle back to where Beatrix stood by the barn, while Goji darted ahead, constantly rubbing his bashed-up knee and stretching out the cramps in his arms and legs. Herbie looked up at his grandma with the most pleading puppy dog eyes he could muster. I think I've got to lie down. I'm sore everywhere. Beatrix laughed. Don't you try that face with me. Besides, you'll only cramp up more if you don't stretch out your muscles. But this doesn't seem to be working. I've got an idea. Wait here. Beatrix disappeared into the barn, leaving Herbie to scratch his head out in the cold. Moments later, she returned with another bicycle, though this one was dark blue, well-oiled, and kept in peak condition. Now you give me the nice one, Herbie exclaimed. Was this old rust bucket some kind of a joke? Beatrix glared at her grandson. This one is mine. Now come on, follow me. Beatrix jumped on the bicycle and tapped her thigh to invite Goji to join her, sending the vixen scurrying up her leg and onto her shoulders in a flash. The two of them were halfway down the road in no time. Herbie watched this feat in awe as his grandma sped down the road, But despite being impressed, he was determined not to be outdone by an old woman. He quickly mounted the old rust bucket and began pedaling as fast as he could to try and catch up with her. When he felt his muscles cramp or his knee ache, he pushed the pain into the back of his mind so that it didn't distract him from balancing. Herbie liked games, but more importantly, Herbie liked winning. "You're slower than a stampede through peanut butter," Beatrix goaded him from up front. Herbie was not about to stand by and get mocked by an old lady, and began kicking down on the pedals with all he had. Before he knew it, he was pedaling up to Grandma Beatrix as she let her bicycle carry her on its momentum. "Tired already, Grandma?" Herbie smiled as he rode up next to her. Beatrix nodded at him with a grin as Goji nipped at the air from her perch. "Not bad, boy. Looks like you just needed the right motivation. Now, how's about we ride into Newtown and get us a treat?" "Newtown?" Herbie queried. "Oh, you'll see. It's quite close up the road. A little too close if you ask me, but I'm sure you'll like it more than these boring old town ranches." As they made their way to the end of the road and beyond, it didn't take long for Herbie to notice the transition into Newtown. The wide-open fields with their dry Nevadan backdrop soon gave way to small duplexes, newly built townhouse complexes with fresh paint and neatly laid-out stone and gravel gardens, crammed to fit in as many houses as a plot would allow. The roads had a fresh layer of asphalt, and the street lamps were set in newly laid concrete, all fitted with solar panels, just like they had back in Washington, D.C. It couldn't compare to his old neighborhood, that was for sure, but he was amazed and somewhat relieved to see that not all of Paradise Rift was stuck in the past. "Well, I didn't expect this," he gleamed, making sure to keep focus on his balance as he looked around. "I like it, do you?" Beatrix replied with an air of gloom as she cycled. "Never used to be like this. It's not normal for a town to spring up out of nowhere, especially after most folks were left broke by the big crash." "What do you mean?" Beatrix sighed. 7 years ago, none of this was here. Then, poof, a whole new town appears. Millions and millions of dollars pumped into a quiet little farming town. There were barely 100 people in Paradise Rift before, and we all thought that Osiris Corp was mad to make such an investment. We couldn't figure out who on earth would come out to our little oasis and fill up all these houses. Then the drought came, and with it, water restrictions. By 2020, folks were paying more for water than gasoline, because they had to clean the salt out of the ocean water to get it. All of a sudden, a place like Paradise Rift, with its own natural springs spewing up fresh, cheap water, didn't seem like such a crazy place to live. "Well, that's great for you, Grandma." Herbie smiled, a little confused as to why Beatrix was so upset. "You didn't have to up and leave to get water." Beatrix nodded. True, but doesn't it make you wonder?" By now, Beatrix's tone was dead serious, her face knotted with worry. "How did they know? How did they have everything built just in time for the drought? Seems fishy to me." Herbie shrugged. "Nah, people have been talking about climate change forever, Grandma. We learned about it from first grade. They could have seen it coming." Beatrix smiled. "Suppose you're right, boy. Would have been nice if they'd just let the river be. Instead, they dammed it up and fed it into the filtration plant. When we destroy something built by man, we call it vandalism. But when we destroy something created by nature, we call it progress." Goji began sniffing the air intently, before turning her head and growling at something down the road, a sleek black Valak Templar auto driver. "Ah, Beatrix," a voice called out from the back seat window. Herbie and Beatrix both snapped to attention as they saw the face of a middle-aged woman poking out of the window of the auto driver that was slowing to a stop just up the road from them. Beatrix squeezed the brakes on her bicycle beside the car as she came to a halt. Herbie tried the same, but squeezed too hard too fast and locked his wheels, sending him wobbling to a fall. Beatrix shook her head as the woman stepped out of the car and looked down at Herbie. "You all right there, kiddo?" The woman smiled down at him. She had a long, thin neck and big doe eyes, thick honey blonde hair styled with too much hairspray so that it didn't budge in the wind, and pale yellow-colored skin layered in makeup. Despite her all-round overdone look, there was something appealing about her, something enchanting. Herbie quickly brushed himself off and hurriedly got to his feet. Beatrix forced a smile and squinted at the woman, while Goji warily peeked over her shoulder. "Tabitha Primrose, always nice to see you." Tabitha responded with a great big grin that seemed less than sincere. "And you?" She gleamed, then aimed her smile at Herbie. "And I suppose this is your grandson we've all been dying to meet." "Herbie," he announced, reaching out his hand to Tabitha's limp grasp. "You own a Valak auto driver? I didn't think I'd see one out here in the middle of nowhere." "This ain't the middle of nowhere, young man. Why, it's practically the center of the universe," Tabitha said with a toothy smile. "But to answer your question, yes, it is a Valak Templar. But no, it's not my personal runaround. It's the first of a fleet the Grand Magus will provide for the citizens of the Rift to get around in. Once the town has gotten a little bigger, of course." "The Grand what now?" Herbie questioned. "Never you mind that, boy," Beatrix interjected before turning back to Tabitha. "It was nice to see you, Tabitha, but we really must be on our way." Completely ignoring Beatrix's words, Tabitha leaned down to meet Herbie's gaze, twisting her face from perfect cheeriness to an exaggerated frown. "I'm so sorry for your loss, little Herbie. It's always so hard losing a parent." Herbie was taken aback by the words. He stared hard at her, not sure how to react. Tabitha switched back to her wide grin. "I'll come by with a care package just like this one," she smiled, pointing to an extravagant basket of fruit, chocolates, pastries, and cupcakes in the back seat of the Templar. "I hear your mother's quite out of sorts since you lost your pay. But don't worry, this is a fantastic community, and we're always here for you to lean on." "How do you know about my father?" Herbie replied sternly. Tabitha rolled her eyes. "Oh, small town, word travels fast. But don't you mind that. Will you be joining us for the Lightseekers meeting come Friday? It's the best way to—" "He will be doing no such thing," Beatrix denounced. "Thank you for your kind offer, Tabitha, but I'm sure we'll be just fine on our own. Anyhow, my grandson and I must be on our way." "All righty then." Tabitha smiled, seemingly unfazed by Beatrix's short temper. "I do hope you like it here in our little town, Herbie. I'll see you soon," she finished with a wink. "Come on then," Beatrix grunted, not giving Herbie much time to find his balance before riding off. Once Tabitha was back in the Valak Templar and had commanded it to continue on its route, Herbie turned to Beatrix. "Lightseekers." "What is that?" "You're probably going to hear a lot about them at school, but please, Herbie, please, stay away from those people. They're crazy. They meet up and stare at the sky trying to find these lights that supposedly appear out of nowhere, saying they're aliens." Beatrix rolled her eyes. "If you are what you eat, this town has to lay off the nuts. Grandma, I told you I saw some lights in the sky last night, just before that woman went screaming down the road. Didn't you hear her? Firstly, your grandma needs one of these to hear properly, and I turn it off when I go to sleep," Beatrix said, tapping on the hearing aid plugged into her left ear. "And secondly, strange things have been going down in Paradise Rift since they built Newtown, and I'll tell you this much, it ain't aliens." "Then what is it?" Herbie asked excitedly. Beatrix looked him up and down and shook her head. "Don't you worry about that now. You just stay indoors if you hear weird noises and whatnot. Anyhow, we were having a nice time before that nut job interrupted us. Why don't we ride up to Big Cottonwood Creek?" Herbie frowned at Beatrix's secretiveness and shrugged. "Okay, I guess. Where do you suppose she was going?" "What's that, boy?" Beatrix puzzled. "Tabitha. She had a care package in her car." "Who do you think it's for?" Herbie persisted. "Well, how should I know?" Beatrix snapped. "Well, I don't know. In Rouge et Noir, my favorite VR game, you've got to watch out for little clues to find out who in the village is secretly a werewolf. Don't you think it's fishy that Tabitha's delivering a care package the night after a lady disappears in the desert?" Beatrix huffed irritably. "Herbie, how many times do I have to tell you? There's no such thing as werewolves, and there wasn't any lady running out in the desert." "You've got to get your head out of the clouds, boy. Sounds like those games have done a number on you." Resigned to Beatrix's stubbornness, Herbie chose not to push the conversation any further, and so they rode on in silence. Herbie loved secrets and adventure. That's what made gaming so much fun. He wasn't used to having things kept from him, and it only made him want to find out more. They took a right out of Newtown, and soon found themselves on a dirt road. Herbie noticed how jarring the transition between Newtown and Old Town was, and could see why the new development might upset Beatrix. Everything outside of it was so quiet and serene, unchanged for more than a century. Newtown was just so new. It seemed so unnatural and out of place, but that didn't mean the people in Newtown were bad, just because they needed somewhere that had water. Herbie shrugged to himself. I guess getting old might mean getting a little bitter and paranoid. Grandma is definitely no easy customer, he thought. As they rode on, Beatrix got irritated with his silence and the tension it created between them. Things had been going so well until that fake-faced Tabitha showed up. So eventually Beatrix gave in and tried to explain.
You know, there used to be a real community in this town where we cared for one another.
But since the church closed down and the light seekers moved in, everyone's got an agenda. I'm sure old Tabitha would have brought some supplies to help us through the month, maybe even some bacon. But the last time she came by the house for some tea, she yapped on about her nut job group for hours, trying to get me to join. What do they want with an old bag of bones like me? There's something weird about them, Herbie. Something's not right. Herbie grinned. I would join them if it meant we got bacon. Boy, if that church were still around, I'd lock you in there and wouldn't let you out until you got your head on straight. Beatrix tutted. Herbie chuckled. Just kidding, Grandma. It looks like we're here. Beatrix smiled, gazing ahead to where the springs came pouring down into the creek. Goji gracefully leaped from her shoulder and darted into the river brush, bouncing around in quick, erratic movements. Better appreciate it while you can, Goji dear, Beatrix sighed before turning to Herbie. The water treatment plant is further downriver, and they'll probably dam up the whole thing in the next few years. You know, the creek once ran right near my house before the... Beatrix noticed that Herbie wasn't listening to a word she was saying. Herbie's eyes were wide, staring at a mansion overlooking the creek. Who lives there? Herbie exclaimed. Beatrix rolled her eyes. The biggest nut job of them all. The man that owns all of Newtown and most of Old Town. The biggest creep that ever walked the face of the planet. You're not very nice, you know that, Grandma? Herbie smiled at her, shaking his head. Just trust your grandma's judge of character, boy. I've got more than a couple of years on you. Herbie tried to listen, but the mansion called to him. It was even bigger than the house he had lived in Washington, D.C., and he hadn't expected to see anything like it in the middle of nowhere. Probably the only brick-built house in the whole town. It stood 3 stories high, with triple-volume windows facing out onto the creek. It seemed elevated against the surrounding flatness, giving it the appearance of a castle looking over a common folks' village. It was painted a sandy brown color, as if to camouflage it into the Nevadan backdrop. Although its green manicured lawns, in fact the only house with a lush, full green lawn Herbie had seen in Paradise Rift, made the property stick out like a sore thumb. It was so peculiar to see this one massive dwelling in a town of tiny houses that Herbie's imagination ran wild with explanations for its existence. Something inside of him cried to explore it. Beatrix noticed his infatuation and didn't like it one bit. Come on, boy. I think we've seen enough, and this cold is getting to my bones. Let's stop off at the diner and get some hot chocolate. Despite wanting to get a closer look at the mansion, Herbie wasn't going to pass up an offer like that. We're moving out, Goji. Herbie called down to the river where the vixen was busy leaping at water bugs. She darted back up the riverbank and up onto Beatrix's shoulder as they made their way back into Newtown. The hungry-eyed diner had been converted from an ancient saloon that had been in Paradise Rift since the late 1800s. They had decided to keep the odd memento from the original establishment, but had otherwise gutted the building, lighting it with fluorescent tubing and covering up the old wooden floorboards with sticky gray linoleum. Herbie was surprised to find that despite the outdated design of the diner, it was kitted out with charging stations at each table, free Wi-Fi, and a VPN to boot. One look at the town square, and it was easy to tell that all of the businesses had undergone a similar facelift. Where small family-owned businesses had once stood for decades, there were now the same corporate-owned chain stores that Herbie knew from Washington, D.C., and across the rest of the United States. Beatrix buttoned up her bulky coat all the way before entering the diner, and made a makeshift nest for Goji beneath it, stashing her away and out of sight like contraband. Goji was less than accommodating of the arrangement, constantly sticking her head out of the coat's collar, much to the surprise of the patrons of the Hungry Eye Diner. When the hot chocolate arrived, Beatrix glugged hers down hurriedly. Whether it was because of Goji's restlessness or the uncomfortable glares from the new Paradise Rift residents that filled the diner for their late Saturday morning breakfast, Herbie couldn't say. "Your ma should be up by now. We shouldn't leave her wandering around the house alone all day," she said, though Herbie could see she would have used any excuse available. "What's with all the weird looks we're getting?" Herbie couldn't help but ask. Beatrix pushed her empty cup toward the middle of the table. "I'm not too popular around here these days." "But you're just a sweet old lady," Herbie winked. "I'm not that old, boy. Now finish up your drink. Let's not stay here any longer than we oughta." Beatrix nodded, pointing to Herbie's half-emptied cup of hot chocolate. Peering around and meeting a few sideways glances from some of the townsfolk, he decided to take his grandma's advice and glug down his drink. They were clearly unwelcome there. Before he knew it, they were back out in the cold and cycling home, Goji happily perched on Beatrix's shoulder. From the diner, they took the most western road around the edge of Newtown, before circling back on the route that led home. As they reached the turn to head back toward the house, Beatrix decided to suddenly stop without warning, nearly launching the unsuspecting Goji from her perch. Herbie had fallen behind her, because his arms and bashed-up knee were getting painful, and it took a moment to catch up to where she had parked herself. She was staring out at an old dirt road that had been cleared from the bits of brown desert brush that had survived winter. At the end of the road, an old church nestled against some tough brush hedges. Despite having seen its fair share of sun and sandstorms, it still beamed its former glory. Only a few slate tiles speckled its arched roof, revealing the faded whitewashed wooden beams beneath. Steep stained glass windows lined either side, although only a few stubborn shards still held true. The sun-beaten whitewashed wooden beams that made up its walls were cracked and holed, letting the desert sand blow through. Even from the end of the road, Herbie could hear the whistling wind take deep breaths in and out of the dilapidated building, playing it like a bagpipe. Miraculously, the churchyard still held its beauty, and despite the desert's endless attempts to reclaim the land, the white picket fence cordoning off the area still stood strong. It seemed to have recently received a fresh coat of whitewash. The lawn was a patchwork quilt of dry and green grass, ravaged by the ongoing drought, but it was neatly manicured with no sign of weeds or invasive desert succulents. Red and yellow flowers had been strategically planted to be both beautiful and resilient in the oscillating Nevadan heat and cold, and cacti larger than Herbie had ever seen rested along the fence, like green pointed guardians standing upright amongst the shrubbery. Herbie squinted and made out several granite gravestones lining its northernmost perimeter. The immaculate churchyard, in contrast with the dilapidated church, was something to behold, and Herbie had assumed Beatrix had simply stopped to take in its beauty. Herbie noticed that even Goji seemed calm in the wake of its grandeur, sniffing the cool air and letting her eyelids droop lazily. But turning to his grandma, he could see pain in her eyes that seemed so ingrained that he didn't dare question it. "This place sure is roached out. What happened here, Grandma?" Herbie asked. But Beatrix was a million miles away, completely entranced by the image before her. He gave her a moment and looked around, but turning just left of the churchyard was an image that his eyes couldn't believe. "What on earth is that?" Herbie exclaimed, pointing to a massive construction site. 2 large cranes bowed over it, and a variety of heavy-duty vehicles were parked alongside them. A massive signboard had been erected beside the site, reading Osiris Corpi, with the symbol of an ankh beneath the lettering and a warning, "Construction site. Private property. No trespassing." Beatrix shook the weariness from her face. That was once the Henderson Pig Ranch. What it is now is a monstrosity. "Promise me you'll never go in there, Herbie, now or ever." Herbie squinted at Beatrix, trying to figure out just what she meant. But Beatrix's face was a stone wall that said, "This is not up for discussion." Sure, Grandma, I promise, Herbie smiled, wondering if his grandma's old age was wearing her mind away into madness. Beatrix stared at him long and hard, but right through him at the same time. The wind played a haunting song through the church's broken wooden beams as she inspected him. It was enough to creep anyone out. "Let's not leave Mom waiting," Herbie said through a forced smile. Beatrix turned back to the construction site. "You're going to grow up in a scary world, my boy. I just hope I'm here with you to guide you through it." Herbie got back on his bicycle to try and hurry her along. "I'll be fine, Grandma, and with all this exercise I've been doing, I'll be strong enough to fight anyone who tries to chance their fortune with me." He winked, pushing himself off and starting down the street. "It's your soul that'll need to grow strong," Beatrix whispered to herself before mounting her bicycle and following Herbie. Goji squealing with glee as wind brushed her face. "Right on to Steadfast Grove, that's us," Beatrix called ahead to Herbie, who had maintained some distance from her since they had set off from the old church building. "Righto," Herbie called back and turned his bike down the road. "Our street's called Steadfast Grove? There isn't a tree in sight," Herbie thought to himself. Beatrix sped up to meet him as they turned the corner. They could make out the old two-story just down the road. As they approached, they noticed 3 figures standing in the empty lot opposite the house. A boy, a girl, both with the same sandy blonde hair, and a rather glum-looking golden retriever lying on the ground by their feet. They seemed to be searching the horizon, out toward the desert, barely noticing Herbie and Beatrix right up behind them. Beatrix gracefully came to a stop on the side of the road, while Herbie slammed on his brakes forcefully, skidding and stopping too fast, letting the bicycle fall out from underneath him, but getting his footing just in time so as to not completely fall over. The teens jerked and snapped around as the sound of scraping metal on asphalt shot out across the empty lot. Herbie freed his ankle where the bicycle hung onto him and awkwardly stepped to its side, trying not to seem like a complete idiot. He looked up at the 2 of them, then down at their dog, and they in turn watched him, seeming somewhat confused with the way he wrestled with the bicycle. Beatrix marched toward them, Goji sensing her tension and bolting ahead of her to growl at the 2 teens and their dog. "What are you kids doing here?" she reprimanded. "I've made it clear I don't want anything to do with no light seekers, so you can go back to whoever sent you and tell him the same." Herbie sheepishly came up behind Beatrix, realizing that the teens must have been roughly the same age as him, and cringing at his grandma's embarrassing outburst. "Not here on official business, ma'am," the boy replied dutifully, but Herbie sensed it might have been an act. "The boys from Humboldt County Animal Control have been snooping around our house this morning, but wouldn't release any details. My sister and I thought we'd do some recon for ourselves." He paused and inspected Goji darting around the retriever. "That's a pretty neat fox you got there." "I just wanted to go for a walk. I'm not with him," the girl inserted sharply, gesturing at the boy. "Animal control?" Beatrix gulped, looking down at Goji terrorizing the teen's fur rug of a retriever, but soliciting little response from the lazy mutt. "Come on, Goji, best you get inside," she continued. "Don't let me catch you near my house again, you hear?" she reprimanded before retreating back to her bicycle, Goji squealing a sigh of reluctance to leave her new friend. Herbie took the opportunity to do some damage control. "Don't mind her, she's just a little paranoid. I'm sure you guys aren't really light seekers," he smiled. "Member Hollis Andrews, entry-level light seeker. For now, at least," the boy grinned, sticking out his hand. "This is my twin sister, Member Brenda Lee, and our loyal hound, Lazy Sam," he concluded, tugging on the retriever's lead, much to the hound's dismay. Herbie shook Hollis's hand warily before turning to his sister. "So you're the new kid?" she asked bluntly. Herbie furrowed his eyebrows. Yeah, I guess so." "So it is true?" Hollis asked. Herbie furrowed his brow at the question. Is, what true?" Herbie replied, trying to maintain a smile. The boy's eyes lit up. "You're starting at Seeker High on Monday?" Yeah," Herbie replied unsurely. A huge smile burst across the boy's face, and suddenly Herbie found himself in his embrace, being lifted into the air and spun around. "Woo-hoo!" screamed the boy. "We're not the new kids anymore." Brenda Lee watched on with a deadpan expression. You're being rude, Hollis, she hissed. Don't mind her. She gets real snappy when I get overexcited. But can you blame me? We've been waiting for this day for 3 years. Hollis burst out with joy, placing Herbie back on the ground. Excuse my brother, he's the world's oldest kindergartner, Brenda Lee said apathetically. Okay, Herbie replied, unsure of the two of them, then turned to Hollis. What do you mean you've been waiting for this day? No one likes the new kid, especially the weirdos in this town, Brenda Lee interjected. Yep, and that's been us since our dad brought us here 3 years ago from Florida, Hollis continued. A deep sense of dread spawned in Herbie's gut. Oh, that seems strange. It was the same back in Washington, D.C., but 3 years seems a little overboard. That's because we're not real light seekers, Brenda Lee replied, rolling her eyes. We are too, Hollis blurted at his sister. We just haven't been at it for as long the rest of them? But once we're no longer the new kids, they'll have to bump us up to acolyte level, and then they'll have no choice but to like us. Brenda Lee turned to Herbie. I'm just playing along. It takes patience to listen to a bunch of crazies, but it takes skill to pretend you're listening. Herbie cleared his throat. I'm not joining the Light Seekers, he reluctantly spoke. My grandma says they're a bunch of wackadoodles. Hollis's face turned to a look of utter shock and horror, while Brenda Lee smiled and shook her head. Everyone in this town is a light seeker. Well, anybody who doesn't want to spend their lives on the outskirts of society, she replied sassily. I think it's ridiculous, but I'm not dumb enough to go against the whole town. Do yourself a favor, sign up as soon as you get to school on Monday, and just play along with the whack jobs. We're not whack jobs, Hollis spat. We're uncovering the secrets of our galactic brethren. Brenda Lee raised her eyebrows as if to say, see what I mean? The surest sign there is intelligent life out there in the universe is that it hasn't tried to contact a bunch of loonies like the Light Seekers. She sighed. The dread in Herbie's stomach grew tenfold. So you guys came all the way out here just to make sure I would join your UFO searchers group so that you wouldn't be the bottom feeders anymore? Negatory. We came out here for recon, Hollis announced. It's not like Humboldt officials to come through this way. Lightseeker business is top secret, so if Dawn allowed them through here, it must be something big, possibly a chupacabra, or maybe even the Galactic Brethren themselves. Plus, we don't live far, Brenda Lee shrugged. We're old towners. Dad isn't one of the broke bankers that followed Dawn to Paradise Rift. He bought an old farmhouse just up the road after his encounter. Broke bankers? Herbie puzzled. Oh yeah, most of the Lightseekers followed Dawn here when they lost everything in the big crash. Desperate people make easy pickings, Brenda Lee noted, but not our dad. He managed to go crazy all on his own. He's not crazy. He was abducted by the Greys, Hollis hissed at his sister. Sorry to interrupt, but who's this Don guy you keep talking about? Herbie inquired. You haven't heard of Don Balcom, Hollis exclaimed. He's the Grand Magus of the Lightseekers, the Master of Encounters. He owns this town, Brenda Lee interjected. He lives in the mansion by the spring. That's who lives there, Herbie exclaimed. I just came from there. It's the last thing I expected to find in this place. That's 'cause Don's super rich and super smart. It was the aliens who made him like that. He says that if you follow him, you'll get your own mansion one day, too. I'm gonna have a roller coaster in mine, Hollis beamed. Herbie shot a desperate look at Brenda Lee, who rolled her eyes in return. Even Lazy Sam let out a long, sluggish sigh. Herbie dropped his shoulders and wearily shook his head. This is all a lot to take in. Hollis pressed his lips together as his eyes set with empathy. I know. Herbie, was it? Herbie nodded. I know what you mean, Herbie. It's taken a while for us to get used to it, but you'll get there. Maybe with me to guide you, you can get to acolyte level in a couple of months. Herbie tilted his head, trying to find the silver lining in all of this. So you guys try to find aliens? And absorb their knowledge, Hollis added. Herbie nodded. Well, I did see something strange last night. I'm not sure if they were aliens, though, but it might explain what animal control was doing around here. Hollis's eyes sparkled with excitement. "What happened?" he whispered as though they were discussing forbidden knowledge. "I heard weird noises last night while I was trying to sleep," Herbie began, triggering an ever wider grin on Hollis's face. "Like chanting, somewhere off in the distance. But when I looked outside, all I could see were these lights in the sky, 6 of them dashing all over the place." "The lights!" Hollis burst with excitement. "But it gets weirder," Herbie continued, enjoying how eager Hollis was to hear more. Suddenly, the lights shot down from the sky and went zipping up the street and out of sight. "No way!" Hollis exclaimed. Brenda Lee just smirked and shook her head, making it clear that she saw no truth in what Herbie was saying. "Totally." Herbie smiled back. "Next thing I know, there's a woman running down the street. She had brown curly hair and had torn right through her own clothes with her nails and into her skin. It was crazy." At that, Brenda Lee perked up. "That's weird." Herbie leaned forward toward them. "I followed her into the desert." "No way," Hollis erupted. "What happened out there?" Herbie leaned back and sighed as he shook his head, the memory still ethereal and dreamlike, completely terrifying at the same time. "It's hard to say, it was so dark I could barely see a thing, but I'll tell you this. I followed a woman into the desert, but what I met out there was no human." Hollis leaned right forward, hanging on his every word, while Brenda Lee feigned disinterest despite a twinkle of curiosity shining in the corner of her eye. Chupacabra?" Hollis dared. Herbie shook his head, stretching out the moment for maximum suspense. "I think it was a werewolf." After a brief pause, the twins burst into laughter. "Ha ha ha, oh, you had us there for a sec." Hollis spewed through a giggling fit. Brenda Lee leaned down and slapped her knee. "I was just trying to play it cool, but I totally fell for it." Herbie folded his arms disappointedly as the twins took their sweet time gaining their composure. Brenda Lee was the first to realize that Herbie had not intended the statement to be a joke. "You're serious?" She smiled in disbelief. Herbie shrugged. "It's the only thing that makes sense to me. What happened to the woman if she didn't turn into a—" Herbie paused as he heard the words coming out of his own mouth and immediately regretted saying them. "Well, she didn't turn into a werewolf," Hollis laughed. "If anything, the chupacabra that the animal control boys were looking for got her. Like that's any more plausible," Herbie argued. Suddenly, Brenda Lee's face went deadly serious. "Hold on, how old was this woman?" "I don't know, maybe late 20s, pale and skinny?" Herbie shrugged. A grave look came across both Hollis's and Brenda Lee's faces. Brenda Lee turned to her brother. "That sounds like—" "Shush," Hollis interrupted. "That's next-level talk. You've already said too much as it is." Herbie watched the interaction more confused than ever. "What is it?" he asked. "Listen, Herbie, there are some things that we're not supposed to discuss with outsiders. But don't worry, I'll help you sign up for the Light Seekers on Monday, and then we can talk all about it," Hollis replied. Herbie gave him a skew smile. Yeah, I'll think about it. You'll be saving yourself a lot of trouble by just biting down and going along with it," Brenda Lee added, then grabbed Lazy Sam's leash from her brother. "Come on, Sammy," she called down to the retriever. Lazy Sam grunted back at her, then raised himself off the road with as little effort as he could muster. "We'll see you Monday," Hollis called as he turned to leave. "Yeah, see you then," Herbie replied, picking up his bicycle and watching them go. "Animal control," he pondered to himself as he stared out into the desert, wondering what it could have been that he'd met out there. "I think I've found another clue." Herbie wheeled his bicycle across the road to the barn, staring down at the worn and dusted tar, trying to digest everything he had just learned. Lost in thought as he rolled the bicycle along the barn's oil-stained concrete floor, he bumped the front tire against a tattered cardboard box, held together by layer after layer of brown packaging tape. The lid had been left open, although a tarp had been thrown over it to keep the dust out. Kneeling down to inspect the curious package, Herbie noticed a pair of dusty white earphones dangling from the side of the box. His heart leaped at the promise of technology. Throwing the tarp off the box and revealing a cluttered collection of old books and ornaments, Herbie grabbed at the earphones and followed the cables through the various odds and ends until finally, coming upon a chunky white rectangular device with an old-school grayscale screen and a circular dial. "What in the world?" Herbie said aloud, running his fingers over the white plastic and rubber on the device's front side and the scratched steel of its back plate. He squeezed it in his hands, smiling at how chunky and sturdy the device was, a true relic from a time before all tech was sleek and fragile. In the clutter of the cardboard box, Herbie spotted a white cable that fit perfectly into the power port at the bottom of the device. While the other end was fitted with a two-prong plug, he punched the device's center button, but it gave no response. Must need a charge. But what could it be? He asked himself, secretly hoping it was some relic of a gaming console that could quench his thirst for video games. He gathered up his findings and stuffed them into the pockets of his coat, moving with an extra spring in his step to get back to his room as fast as possible. But it didn't take long before his sudden burst of curiosity and excitement gave way to the sense of impending doom that his conversation with the twins had left with him. He had figured there'd be a couple of light seekers around after running into Tabitha, but the whole town, Paradise Rift, was going to be a living nightmare. Just stay positive, Herbie, he thought to himself as he made his way to the porch, doing his best to shove his fears down into the bottom of his pockets, alongside his new toy. He pushed open the front door and heard Grandma Beatrix muttering into the landline in the next room. He entered the modest living room. The emerald-colored curtains were drawn, shrouding the room in shadows. The lounge was adorned with tattered green sofas from a bygone era and speckled with ceramic ornaments on every free tabletop and mantel. Dust tickled his nose, carried on thick air that tasted like wood varnish. Beatrix was hanging up the phone as Herbie stepped through the door. Her face was pale and her eyes murky and distant. "Grandma?" Herbie asked, sensing the aura of grief radiating off of her. "Is something wrong?" he continued. She ran her bottom lip across her teeth as she thought, trying to find the words to say, "It's nothing, boy. Just some bad news about an old friend." She nodded. "Oh," Herbie muttered, unsure whether to pry further. "Is Mom up?" he asked. "I'll check on her in a moment. I just need to sit down." She slowly waddled over to the sofa, her age now showing without the support of her wild spirit to keep her standing. His heart became heavy as he watched her, his empathy absorbing her apparent pain. "Anything you want to talk about, Grandma?" he attempted, trying to figure out how to get back the person he had just been cycling around town with. No. I just need a minute." "Go wash up and I'll make you and your mom a sandwich," she tutted without looking up at him. "Okay, Grandma." Herbie nodded, waiting a moment before leaving, hoping she would say something to reveal what pained her so. Someone's dead, he thought to himself as he made his way to the bathroom. Alien lights, werewolf women, crazy cults, and dying friends. What have you got yourself into, Herbie? This is one strange town.